take a look at 8 players here that we are sort of avoiding in fantasy drafts. Each of us are going to list 4 different players that we are essentially not drafting, guys that just are not on our draft list. Typically, at their current value, we're just crossing them off the list. Dave, just to steal the line from Step Brothers, we're not drafting them, even if there's a fire.
I'm Dad.
Well, I'm not going to, ever. Even if there's a fire.
I can't say the rest of it, but it's a good line. Good movie. Go watch it. Step Brothers. All right. Dave, hit us with your first player that is on your do not draft list at the moment.
You know, I'm starting from the top rope, just jumping off of it. Davante Adams right now is a round 2 pick. And like we talked about in the intro, you know, it's kind of a little bit of a sliding scale. Like Davante Adams, he needs to fall probably, 8 picks below ADP before I'm even entertaining drafting him right now. And it's nothing against Davante Adams. Like we know that he's a fantastic football player, just 2 years removed from a 1,500-yard season. But we're playing in a game of possibilities and range of outcomes here. And that's working against Davante Adams. You know, I looked in over the last decade, we've seen 126 wide receivers play a season age 32 or over. Guess how many of them eclipsed 1,000 yards? Out of those 126 in the last 10 years, just 6. That's it. And one of those guys was last year. You know, we saw Adam Thielen do it. So, like, it can be done. It's possible, but it's unlikely. So, over the last 10 years, those guys that I mentioned are good players, and you'd expect that. You know, we're not seeing these flukes out of nowhere, but it's been Adam Thielen, Julian Edelman, Andre Johnson, Larry Fitzgerald, Steve Smith, and Anquan Bolden. Now, I think that you can look at Davante Adams as like being that caliber of player. You know, he's a future Hall of Famer, and we do see these guys late in their career defy the odds. We're seeing it with Mike Evans. You know, he's going into his 31 season, and he might still have a couple 1,000-yard seasons left in him. But typically, we don't see wide receivers at that age continue with that production. And we're starting to see some trends here. You know, the yards per game for Davante Adams have trended down for 4 consecutive seasons. He just had the lowest yards per game since 2017. So that's concerning. And of course, the situation last year wasn't great, but it's not like it got a whole lot better this year. You know, now he's got more target competition with Brock Bowers in the picture. I don't know if you can say Gardner Minshew is like a huge upgrade from Aiden O'Connell. We don't even know for sure that Gardner Minshew is going to be the starter. And really, again, like we said, you know, being out on these players has everything to do with ADP. And some of the guys that are going after Davante Adams, Nico Collins, Jalen Waddle, Deebo Samuel, they're going after him in ADP, and I prefer those guys outright. So it's really hard for me to draft Davante Adams when guys like Nico Collins, Waddle, and Deebo are still on the board.
When you look at the potential of Gardner Minshew being the starting quarterback, even Aiden O'Connell for that matter, Davante Adams was the wide receiver 11 last season in PPR, and Michael Pittman was the wide receiver 13 in PPR. Gardner Minshew was his quarterback last year. I'm not going against you because I'm not high on Davante Adams either. My question is this, like, do you still sort of have that little glimmer of hope that Davante Adams is worth the pick in round 2 is tough right now. That's where he's going. He's a wide receiver 10 going late round 2. That's tough. If he's in round 3, are you saying, okay, I'll click that button?
Yeah, if he falls into round 3, probably. I view him much closer to Mike Evans. And the thing is, you can get Mike Evans almost a full round later, and Mike Evans is younger, and we know the situation that he's in and that he has a good chemistry with Baker Mayfield. What you talk about with Gardner Minshew, I think, is a good point. You know, Gardner Minshew did support Michael Pittman putting up an elite season last year, but Michael Pittman had almost no target competition. I mean, we were looking at Alec Pierce, rookie Josh Downs, a bunch of tight ends that you probably couldn't even name. And then you look at this situation in Las Vegas. This is going to be similar to what we saw last year in Indianapolis, where it's going to be a run-first team. But the difference is, rather than it just being Davante Adams being the only viable weapon in the passing game, they also have Jacoby Myers, and they have Brock Bowers, and they have Michael Mayer. So there are some red flags there, you know, just more target competition that we're already seeing the downturn happening for Davante Adams, and I would just rather get out early than get stuck holding the bag if he does fall off the age cliff this year. And it's not that I'm out on every old receiver. I mean, there's a lot of other guys that are going into their age 32 season as well this year. Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins, Adam Thielen, Tyler Lockett, Odell Beckham Jr. The difference with all of them is that their age is baked into their ADP. They're getting drafted way, way later. So I'm willing to take the risk on those guys because I don't have to invest premium draft capital. Davante Adams is still commanding that premium draft capital, and at age 32, that's just enough to scare me away.
Yeah, I think both of us are kind of out on Davante Adams, even even if he's in round 3. Man, like I don't quite see it right now. The average draft position for Davante Adams, wide receiver 10, going late round 2. I've got him at wide receiver 15, so I don't even know that I would take him in round 3. You've got him at wide receiver 19, which means you're not touching him with a 30-foot pole. Like you're just out on Davante Adams. You're maybe taking him in like round 4 or 5, like if he's falling there. It's understandable. It's understandable. All right, before we move on, we've got our giveaway that we have been talking about, the Scott Fish Bowl spot that we are ready to give away. We're going to be giving out more as the summer goes on here, okay? In order to qualify for this, in order to be entered to win another spot, subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify, and then please, after you listen to the episode, leave a review. It is that simple. I'm not going to force you to leave a 5-star review. I'm just saying you're more likely to win if it's a 5-star review. Just saying. Once you do that, take a screenshot. You can send that review over to abrown@footballguys.com. I get all those. I'll respond to you, let you know that you've been entered into the contest. We've actually got our first winner. Dave, last week's winner is on Twitter at RJW615,
J
better
Dog.
known in the Twitter streets as J-Dog. DAWG, spell it right. So congrats, J-Dog. I don't know if that's your government name, but congrats. You are going to be getting a Scott Fishbowl spot. And for those of you who have not gotten your spot yet, just make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You're here watching on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, like this video, drop a comment down below, maybe talking about one of these players, maybe someone who's on your do not draft list, or maybe why we're wrong about one of these players. And you can share this with your friends. All right. It's a big help for us. Dave, I'm going to go to the next player that I want to talk about here that's on the do not draft list for me. And I've already talked about him once this offseason, and I'm just going to keep this going. The hate train is going. I know we said that we're not hating these players, but the hate train is gaining steam. I'm not feeling it with Stefon Diggs,
Yeah.
David. I'm
No.
just not. I'm just not. The average draft position for Stefon Diggs right now across multiple platforms, wide receiver 17. And I just think that's nuts. That's absolutely nuts to me that Stefon Diggs is going in the 3rd round after how last year ended for him. And the team that he's on, the target competition is so much tougher on the Texans, Dave. I just don't. This is more target competition than I think he's had in his career, if I'm not mistaken. Like that he has not had to play with this caliber of wide receiver before. So I don't get why the value is still holding. Okay. Last year, Stefon Diggs, so much of his value is tied into the fact that he was the guy. He was the top receiver for his team. He had the volume, over 9 targets per game last season. And then in his final 8 weeks, while still getting great volume, just 1 finish in the top 25. I don't get how we're valuing this player this way. Like you mentioned with Davante Adams, he's a little bit older. Stefon Diggs, he's turning 31. I just want to take a look at some 31-year-old receivers from last year. Keenan Allen, phenomenal season. Wide receiver 3 overall in points per game. He led the NFL in the wide receivers in targets per game at 11.5. Davante Adams, decent season. Wide receiver 20 in points per game. He was 5th in targets at 10 per game. DeAndre Hopkins, another older guy, wide receiver 29, 16th in the NFL in targets at 8 per game. And then you get down to Tyler Lockett, wide receiver 43, 7 targets per game. Look at the top 2 wide receivers on the Texans. They each averaged 7 targets per game.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily a direct correlation where you're saying, well, 7 targets per game means he's going to be the wide receiver 43 like Tyler Lockett. No, my point is that those were the top receivers on this team. I can't expect Stefon Diggs to walk into Houston, become the top wide receiver, totally negate everything that Nico Collins has done, the relationship with Tank Dell, the money that they've paid Nico Collins. Like they are going to use these guys. Stefon Diggs is, I'm not going to call him an afterthought, but he is absolutely the 3rd target on this team. And for us to still be drafting him like he's the 1st or maybe a 1B, I think it's just like, honestly, at this point, it's just kind of irresponsible. I think he's closer to finishing where Tyler Lockett did and DeAndre
Mhm.
Hopkins did around wide receiver 30 and 40 than he is at his current average draft position of wide receiver 17. And I think that what we're doing here and what people are doing, and it's obviously early, this is going to change as drafts happen, but a lot of it is just that name value. This is a player that we've loved for years. It's been good for years. He's on a good team now, good offense, good quarterback. It's all good, right? Not necessarily.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I've got it ranked that way where I might be a little crazy. I don't know how everyone else is ranking it, but I've got Tank Dell flat out ahead of Stefon Diggs in my
Yeah,
rankings
way
right now,
ahead.
and he's getting drafted rounds afterwards. It's kind of crazy to see the way that's shaken out. And Jeff Bell and I were doing that audio only series right now. Where we're kind of doing a deep dive into each team, and Jeff and I agreed with this, and you're kind of
It's
saying
the
a lot of the
Sicko
same
series,
things.
by the way. That's what you guys need to call it, the Sicko series,
It is, yeah.
because
We're
they're
yeah.
phenomenal.
Recommend checking it out if you want some very off the cuff. Just we don't go no show sheet or anything. We just BS for an hour and a half talking about different
That's not how
divisions.
you
But
sell it. That's you don't sell it by saying we
it's
BS for an hour. We they
it's
do
I
they,
think
these
it's
guys
fun.
deep dive
Yeah.
into the teams in each of these divisions, like just combing through the depth charts and everything that's projected for that season. It's great conversation. Absolutely check it out if you haven't done so already.
Well, thank you. But what I was going to say is Jeff Bell and I completely agree with you because we talked about this Houston Texans team, and Jeff Bell is an old Bill or is a Bills fan, and he kind of had a take that might rub some people the wrong way, but talked about how, Stephon Diggs' ego is basically what got him booted from Buffalo. That, there was this kind of thing where Stephon Diggs showed up in Buffalo and he helped elevate Josh Allen. And then Josh Allen took those steps forward and kind of showed that, hey, I could still be a really good quarterback without forcing the ball to Stephon Diggs. I can get Khalil Shakir and Dalton Kincaid and James Cook and these other guys going. And it seemed like Stephon Diggs maybe just had an issue with the way that the ball was getting spread out in the second half of the season, and that's why he wanted to trade and he wanted to leave. So we've seen a weird thing with Stephon Diggs where like he is for all intents and purposes been a superstar throughout his NFL career, but somehow kind of ran his way out of Minnesota and then ran his way out of Buffalo. And I don't know, like I don't want to talk about somebody's character that I've never met before, but it is kind of interesting that we've seen him kind of overstay his welcome with two teams now, and now going into a third team where he's the old guy
Hmm.
and there's two very established and very good young wide receivers. It is so easy to picture a scenario where Stephon Diggs starts the year as the wide receiver 3 and then maybe isn't happy in that role and kind of phones it in like he did in Buffalo, and then all of a sudden you've just lit a draft pick on fire, a third round draft pick on Stephon Diggs, and just completely lit it on fire.
This may be a really ill-timed comment that I'm going to make, and if we decide we want to take it out of the podcast or out of the YouTube, we can. You rem Do you remember the video of, I think it was when he was on the Vikings, where all of the it was the social media team asking the players on the Vikings, who was one teammate that you would not let date your sister? And
Yes.
they
Oh
all
my
said
gosh.
Stephon Diggs.
Yes, I completely
Every
forgot about that.
single one of them said Stephon Diggs, and when he
Yeah.
found out, he pretended to be shocked, but kinda wasn't. He just sorta
Mhm,
smirked.
mhm.
I wonder what the overlap is on that.
Yikes.
Anyways, we're not gonna talk about someone's character. Stephon Diggs seems like a very nice guy, a jovial guy, a hard competitor. It's it's so much just the situation. You have him as your wide receiver 30 in the rankings. I have him at wide receiver 32. We are both a far cry away from where he's getting drafted in early drafts. And I hope that the drafters get a little bit smarter, a little bit more careful with the way they're picking. I think he might be going down the draft boards.
I hope they
Uh,
don't. Stay where he is
that's
with that
true.
current
Yeah, yeah,
ADP. Let my league
yeah.
mates take him. It just opens up even better value for me.
If we see a change in ADP, it just means people are listening, which is great. Which is great. All right. Dave, why don't you take us to the next guy that we have here? Jayden Reed, wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers. Oh boy. Oh, that
I
face.
I just the show like pains me because like I
Yeah,
like
it's harsh.
Davante Adams. Like dude's a baller. I like Davante Adams. Like I want to root for Davante Adams, but I gotta sit here and tell you not to draft him. And I like Jayden Reed. Like Jayden
Mm.
Reed can play. Like we saw last year, he is a very good wide receiver, and they found creative ways to get the ball to him on jet sweeps and backfield usage and pre-snap motion and all these fun things. But I think we might have gotten a little bit overexcited right now with his current ADP. He's getting drafted as what, the wide receiver 34, I believe. It's different from
Wide
platform to
receiver
platform.
36,
36, yeah. So I mean,
round
we're
7.
drafting this guy to be a wide receiver 3, and I'm just not crazy about that right now. I think if anything, we should be drafting him to be the wide receiver 3 in Green Bay, not a top 36 fantasy wide receiver. I'm going to read off some numbers here, and I know numbers can get boring and hard to pay attention to, but bear with me for a second, all right? He was 17.6% target share last year. That was 49th in the league. Bad. He had a 10.3 ADOT last year, which was 60th in the league, also bad. Now, I talk about this all the time. Like, if a player has a low ADOT, I want them to have a
Mhm.
high target share. And if a player has a low target share, I want them to have a high ADOT. He doesn't have either of those. Very similar to like Rashi Rice that we were talking about, like kind of a gimmicky player, if you will. Like, he isn't getting a lot of touches, and when he is, he's getting them close to the line. Air yard share, 20.9% was 61st in the league, also bad. This is what really jumps out to me though.
I love the also bad.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to sum it up for you, so I'm not boring you too much with numbers here, trying to contextualize what 61st among wide receivers means. But this is the one that
Bad.
really scares me. He was below a 70% route participation last year, which was 78th in the league. This guy just simply wasn't getting on the field. Like when they were running 2 wide receiver sets, Jayden Reed was sitting on the bench, just clapping along, saying, go get him, team. He wasn't out there. He was only
Supportive.
coming on the field for slot snaps. And that was great because like when they were running 3 wide receiver sets, he was on the field and he was 13th in the league in slot snaps. But man, there's a lot of concern. I looked at like his open score on ESPN, 82nd. Looked at his average cushion on Player Profiler, 90th. Like all of the things that we want to see from a young wide receiver, the numbers just aren't there. Now there are some numbers that point to some promise, possibly, like the alluring metrics for Jayden Reed. I want to tell both sides of the story. Fantasy points per target was great. Fantasy points per fantasy points per route run was great, and QB rating when targeted was great. But that is all heavily skewed because he didn't get a lot of targets and he didn't run a lot of routes and he scored a lot of touchdowns. So anybody who's played fantasy or listened to fantasy content knows that touchdowns are not sticky, they're not predictive, they're kind of fluky. So last year, and I'm victim to this. We did a dynasty startup right after the season ended, and I reached for Jayden Reed because what we remember is that like over the second half of the season, he was a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. But that came on the back of just scoring touchdowns almost every single week. At the end of the day, his usage wasn't great. His ability to get open wasn't all that great either. And he was essentially the wide receiver 3 in Green Bay. And it's a very ambiguous situation. A lot of all rookies in year 2 guys last year. Things could certainly change going into 2024. But I think Christian Watson's got a higher ceiling than Jayden Reed. I think Dubs and Reed should be a little bit closer in ADP. Wicks should be a late round dart throw. Typically, what we see is like wide receiver ambiguity suppresses everybody's value, but for some reason, it's increasing everybody's value in Green Bay. I think it's because everybody's very in on Jordan Love. So I find myself struggling to draft a lot of the Packers wide receivers at cost, but especially Jayden Reed, who is the first Packers wide receiver going off the board.
I think when we look at the Packers wide receivers, and I hope I'm using this correctly, and I'm sure the commenters will let me know. It feels sort of like a Schrodinger's cat type deal where it's like they all look like the wide receiver 1 from the outside until you go and you dive into the numbers, and then you're like, "Oh, that's not the wide receiver 1."
Yeah, they
But
got a
until you
bunch of
do
wide
that, they
receiver
look like the
threes.
wide receiver 1. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, this is a really good offense. They're a good quarterback, good passing game, and all these guys are talented. Maybe we don't have a wide receiver 1 here, and it's very possible. I think there's a lot of questions that we can have about a guy like Jayden Reed. Like we can say, he probably didn't get the usage that we want or the targets that we want to see because he was a rookie, right? Because he had the limited experience, because these were guys that had worked with Jordan Love before and worked in an offense before. We can say that. It doesn't necessarily make it true. I think that the concerns you bring up are very valid, right? Like it's Jayden Reed going at wide receiver 36. You have him at wide receiver 40. I've got him at wide receiver 38. Feels like we have him pretty aptly ranked. He's a 7th round player right now. And I think that when we're looking for guys in the 7th round where this is going to be probably a flex for you,
Mhm.
depending on your build, you want some really, really strong upside. And I think what you laid out there is that there's maybe not the same upside for Jayden Reed as there might be for some of these other guys getting drafted in that same range.
Now the
And
upside case. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, no, go for it.
I was gonna say the upside case is that he grows that snap share. Last year, on average, he saw 56% of the offensive snaps. That's horrendous. I mean, he was a part-time player. And the upside case is that he jumps either Romeo Dubs or Christian Watson and
Right.
is a part of those two wide receiver sets. And then, of course, if he's able to maintain that efficiency that we saw last year, like if he's a full-time player getting a 90+% snap share while still maintaining the efficiency that we saw last year, then there is an upside case here. And he can be a really good fantasy player. I just don't know if we can project him to jump all of those guys in the depth chart. And the way ADP has it right now, they are already saying that Jayden Reed has done that and that he's going to be on the field for two wide receiver sets. And I just can't do that. Romeo Dubs is a guy who isn't flashy. He's not. Like the advanced metrics tell us that he is an okay NFL receiver, but he does all the gritty things. Like it kind of reminds me of what they lost a couple of years ago in Alan Lazard, where he's not going to be a guy that's going to pull a huge target share, but he's out there getting involved in the run blocking and he's making plays after the catch and he's sure-handed and he's somebody that they can rely on near the end zone. And he might not have the flashiest skill set. He might not be great for fantasy football, but he's good for real life football. And that's going
Yeah.
to keep him on the field. And that's kind of, I think, where there's a divergence right now is like Jayden Reed has a better profile for fantasy football, but Romeo Dubs is the better football player. And I'm not
He's
in Matt
Jacoby
LaFleur's
Myers.
head. Yeah.
Jacoby Myers. Like, it's not sexy, but you're
Yeah.
like, he's a wide
Yeah.
receiver 3 all the time. It's so annoying.
And I don't think Matt LaFleur cares about fantasy football. I think he wants to win football games.
And I don't think any coach cares about fantasy football, except maybe like Sean McVay, and even then.
He does.
Um,
He had Kyron Williams on his team last year, which
I
is
know, for
hilarious.
sure, for sure. The thing with the Packers is it's funny is like I don't know that there's an NFL team quite like them where we all agree that they're good, but I really feel like we don't know anything about them. We still don't know anything about them. They've got a brand new running back. We still have only seen a year of Jordan Love. We still have not seen all these wide receivers together on the field. Like we haven't seen the two tight ends in the field together. We don't know anything about them yet. So I think you've got to bake that into the ranking here for a guy like Jayden Reed.
Yep.
I'm going to go to my next guy. And this is maybe it's just a case of like he burned us all last year. I think I'm trying to come at this case with as much grounded understanding and nuance as possible. And it's Calvin Ridley, who I just don't want to draft. Right now, the average draft position for Calvin Ridley, wide receiver 33 in the 6th round. To put it as simple as possible, I don't want Calvin Ridley to be the 6th best player on my team. I don't want to have him as a starting wide receiver in my lineup each week. And we've seen the best case scenarios for Ridley, right? Like whether it's been in Atlanta or even like the crazy thing is that last year's season was not bad for NFL standards, but it was bad for fantasy standards. We've seen these years
The
where he's
usage
having
was
8
there
and 10
too.
touchdowns.
Like if he just corralled some of those catches, we'd be like, "Wow, Calvin Ridley was great last year."
Well, yeah, and so you're a few catches away. The issue now is, okay, does he get that same usage in Tennessee? Are they going to throw the ball as much as Trevor Lawrence did? Is that ball going to be even nearly as accurate as it was with Trevor Lawrence? The thing, Will Levis has to make a huge jump in play for this to work. And it's not just that Will Levis has to make a jump, but Calvin Ridley has to make a jump because there is this target competition. I'm not going to bring up Traylon Burks, but there's DeAndre Hopkins, there's Tyler Boyd, there's Tony Pollard being added. You still got Tajay Spears, who's going to be catching passes. That offensive line is still not very good. So you've got all these things here where Will Levis is maybe not going to have the time needed to develop, but the team made these signings and these draft picks that say we want to support Will Levis. That's great for Will Levis, and that's great for the Tennessee Titans for NFL football. It's not necessarily great for Calvin Ridley for fantasy football. And this is a guy that's on the older side. We keep talking about these older wide receivers that are hitting that, that threshold where we get scared. But you've got an older wide receiver with an inexperienced quarterback, an inexperienced head coach. And also, Dave, we've talked about this in the past, and I want to bring it up again. He's a free agent signing. And these almost never work out. We have had one free agent wide receiver finish in the top 27 in fantasy over the last 6 years. And that was Christian Kirk on the Jaguars, where Calvin Ridley just was. I look at these last year, DeAndre Hopkins signs with the Titans, wide receiver 29. Jacoby Myers, who we were just talking about as a good player, wide receiver 28. Like, you go back and you hear the names like Kenny Galladay, Emmanuel Sanders, Golden Tate, Allen Robinson. All these guys were not very relevant fantasy receivers. They all hovered around that wide receiver 40 range or worse. I'm not necessarily saying that Calvin Ridley is going to be down there, but I think it's a lot more likely that he's down there than that he actually pays off at his current draft cost in round 6. And we talked about that Packers offense and how, like, you're not all the way in on a guy like Jayden Reed. If I'm going to go for the touchdown dependent deep ball guy who can make plays, give me Christian Watson. I'll take Christian Watson in round 9 over Calvin Ridley in round 7. Maybe that's crazy, but like I don't like the cost for Ridley. I'm not excited about Will Levis in that Titans offense, Dave. I don't know about you.
Yeah, and I think it's funny that Brian Callahan is just like, yeah, we're going to put Calvin Ridley in the Jamar Chase role. It's like that.
Okay.
How can you compare those guys? Like
What's
Jamar
the
Chase,
Jamar Chase role? Just tossing
yeah,
it deep to an elite receiver? Like, they
right.
tried that already in Jacksonville,
And,
bud.
I'm sure Antonio Pierce would love to put Gardner Minshew in the Patrick Mahomes role, but it doesn't work like that. Like, you can't just
You
say
can't
that
do
this.
that while I'm drinking water, man.
Well, like, it's crazy to me. Like, I think
Yeah.
Brian Callahan's going to be in for a rude awakening when he tries to
Right.
turn Will Levis into Joe Burrow and Calvin Ridley into Jamar Chase and DeAndre Hopkins. Maybe DeAndre Hopkins can play the T Higgins role. That's where I'll say that maybe they can do that, where they can get outside the numbers and make some jump catches. But I just don't see it happening. Like Jamar Chase, what he did in Cincinnati, we're talking about a guy who's a top 5 pick in the NFL, a guy who is a little bit shorter and stockier than Ridley, that has elite burst. That is not a part of Calvin Ridley's game. Like, what we see Jamar Chase, like the way he breaks football, is when you give him a little screen and he breaks a tackle and then he beats everybody on the field and scores an 80-yard touchdown. Calvin Ridley doesn't have that in his skill set. Like, he's a very good route runner. He can run routes deep downfield, but everything he does, it takes a little bit longer to develop because he doesn't have that elite burst. And he's somebody who has these longer developing routes. And I don't know, they've got the offensive line that can help keep Will Levis upright, and maybe he can make some of those throws. But I'm just, it's tough for me to imagine Calvin Ridley paying off this ADP. DeAndre Hopkins is a couple years older, but he's going later than Calvin Ridley. I would just flat out prefer DeAndre Hopkins to Calvin Ridley, knowing that I can get
Yeah.
him 2 or 3 rounds later.
Yeah. I could not agree more. Okay. We're gonna move on here and keep the hate train going. We're just shoveling coal into this hate train right now. This is a dangerous episode. I'm sure the
Mhm.
comments are going to be great. But so listen, if you're hating this episode that's filled with hate, go back to some of the other episodes that we have. They were actually great. They were great. If this one sucks for you, then okay, cool. Just go back to some of the other ones. We had some awesome guests: Andy Behrens, JJ Zacharyson, the guys from Player Profile. We've had Julia Papworth. We've talked with other staffers here from Football Guys. We've got over 12 hours of fantasy football content here on the new YouTube channel. So make sure you're subscribed. And honestly, if you're just listening on the podcast, go over to the YouTube channel. You can see my new setup. I've got a whole bunch of ridiculous, like, nerdy toys and a Star Wars poster and like a lightsaber looking light behind me. Go check it out. It's you got to subscribe. Dave, next player up here. This one hurts. This one
Yeah.
hurts, and I wish it was different. And I understand that you kind of set a chain of action in motion when you and Jeff Bell started talking about Nick Chubb. And then almost within the day,
I
a
said it
video
too.
surfaces of Nick Chubb on Twitter.
Uh-huh. Yeah, we had a long discussion in our AFC North episode about the Cleveland Browns backfield, and Jeff Bell and I both agreed that, like, Jerome Ford, Deonta Foreman, absolutely great values right now, and we don't want anything to do with Nick Chubb. And then I put a bow on that conversation saying, well, now that we've written Nick Chubb off for dead, I'm sure there's going to be some news tomorrow morning that he's making this miraculous recovery. And wouldn't you know it, today there's a video that came out where it's Nick Chubb on his injured knee, jumping back and forth, putting all of his body weight on that injured knee. But at the end of the day, that is a lot different. Wearing shorts in a gym is a lot different than playing football and putting pads on and taking hits and making lateral cuts. And it's just Nick Chubb. He's going into his age 29 season, coming off a multi-ligament knee injury, the second injury to that knee. And I think there's just, they don't have like a dying need to get Nick Chubb back. I think Jerome Ford and Deonta Foreman are a pretty formidable duo. They'll be able to shoulder a lot of the work while Nick Chubb can kind of take his time recovering. there is, I guess the positive thing is that Nick Chubb got hurt early last season. It was in week 2, so by the time week 1 rolls around, it'll be almost a full calendar year that he'll have to recover. But he's older. It's a complicated injury. It's an injury he's suffered before. And then a lot of the times, the outs that we see for these guys coming back from ACL injuries are when they can get it done as pass catchers. Like we just saw last year with Brees Hall. And Nick Chubb has never been a pass catcher. Like he's not a guy that's going to be out there running a ton of routes and catching a ton of passes. So that limits his upside as well. And then another thing, like Nick Chubb is great at what he does, making defenders miss in small spaces and having that initial burst to kind of run through defenders, but he doesn't have that high end athleticism. And typically, when we do see guys recover from ACL injuries, it's because they're high end athletes. Brees Hall, Adrian Peterson, Jamal Williams, or I'm sorry, not Jamal Williams, Jamal Charles. Nick Chubb, if you
Him
looked,
too.
despite his numbers, he doesn't profile to be like one of those top 5 percentile athletes. And then on top of that, on top of the injury, broken tackle rate has gone down in 4 straight seasons. His success rate has dropped in 4 straight seasons. Last full season we saw him play in 2022, he had a career low in yards after contact per attempt. So there's already some warning signs, right? That Nick Chubb is getting up there in age. And now he's coming off of a serious injury with increased touch competition. It's just really tough for me to draft Nick Chubb where he's going. I think even a lot of people that are going to draft him, if he's not ready week 1 or if he doesn't look 100%, you're going to draft him. He's going to clog your roster up for a couple of weeks. Bye weeks are going to roll around and you're going to end up cutting him and making room for somebody else. So it's just not somebody that I really feel comfortable drafting where he's currently going.
The wild thing is that unless I've missed it, even Nick Chubb has said there is no timetable for my return date.
Right.
And the people who study this and the PTs on Twitter who understand the recovery process and how the performance will be for a player of this age with this injury are kind of saying you're probably not seeing him on the field all that much until like a week 8, week 9, week 10, midway through the season. So it's like, what value are you getting back from a guy like this? And you mentioned how tough that injury was, right? Like how it was ACL and MCL in week 2, as I'm reading right here. He needed 2 surgeries to repair the
Yeah.
damage.
So
I
that's the
get
other
it that
thing too that I want to
he's
say
a
is
freak.
like
Yeah.
it's usually 9 months from the surgery date that they say we could expect them to be back. And because he needed that second surgery, that pushes the entire timetable back for
Yep.
his return. So I've seen a lot of mixed reviews, but I defer to Stefania Bell. I think that she is just like the best of the best when it comes
Yep.
to injury
Elite.
analysis. Um, well, next to our Adam Hutchison, of course.
More than one person can be elite. More than one
Yeah.
person can be the best.
No, Stefania Bell's great at what she does, though, and she said that like she doesn't think that he's going to come back until late in the year, and doesn't think that we're ever going to see him at 100% this year. So
Yep.
yeah,
That case
give me
closed.
Jerome Ford, give me Deonta Freeman or Deonta Foreman.
Yeah, Deontay Foreman too. Yeah. Both.
Yeah. Devonta
Both.
Freeman, man, how deep in the weeds are we getting here?
That's all right, buddy. You can take a break. I got it. I'll take over from here. Yeah, Nick Chubb. The average draft position is weird, and I think it'll catch up. I think that the people that are drafting Nick Chubb right now as running back 36 in the 9th round are the ones that likely have not checked their phone in like 10 months. Like
Like
that's
Nick
who's
Chubb, that kid from Georgia, he's pretty good, right?
yeah. No, like it's that guy who's like, oh, I remember him. Why is he still here? Yeah, steal the draft. Tim Brady. Got it. That's that person. We both have him really low. I got him at running back 39, just a little bit below consensus. I should probably be lower, honestly. I don't know why I got to update that. Dave, you got him at running back 49, which feels a little bit closer to where I'd have him. Like this is the epitome of the player that you don't want to draft for your fantasy football team.
Look at us.
I'm going to go to
We're
another.
agreeing so much on this show, Alfredo. This is
That's what
we're
it is.
uncharted
That's what
waters.
binds us. It's the hate. It's the
Yeah,
hatred.
yeah. Hopefully, I
That's what
disagree with
that's
this
what makes
next guy you're going
people.
to talk about.
Of course you will. That's what makes people bond over watching us. They just hate us, and they can hate us together. It's great. I'm going to talk about another old running back, and it's
I'm
Austin
probably not going
Ekeler.
to disagree. Oh yeah, I agree with you on this one too. Sorry, go ahead.
Yep, there we go. Look, it's Austin Ekeler. Right now, the average draft position for Austin Ekeler, running back 32. He's going in the 8th round. That means that people are looking at him as a running back 3, which means you want him as a flex, you want him as a starter, you want him as a guy that you can potentially start at one of your running back spots, depending on how late you're going for running backs. I just don't see how he's doing that or doing that at a high level this year. Once again, there's a theme with this. It's an older player. I think, Dave, what it is, honestly, we're just scared of these older players that they're just going to fall off of that age cliff.
Yeah.
So it's like, if you know what that happens, right? Why would you take the risk there? I can't think, man. The only example I have of doing something risky or doing something we shouldn't do is like a really one that I'm not going to use for the podcast. It's like I wish I had a better analogy for this. Um, it's just, why take that risk? Like, there's not even a great upside to getting a player like this. Some of these older guys, so it's like Eckler's going to have more rushing and receiving competition on the Commanders than he even had in Los Angeles, right? Like, it was basically just him and Keenan Allen. The receiving and the touchdown upside is going to be more limited than ever because now you've got a rushing quarterback who's likely not dumping it off as much. He's going to be running himself, doing a little RPO action. And then you just take a look back at what happened from week 12 on. Eckler was just incredibly inefficient, not an explosive guy. He had 77 rush attempts where he totaled just one carry of 10 yards or more. That's a guy that's just, listen, we can say whatever we want, right? We can claim it was the injury that he had week 1. And I get it. Sometimes injuries linger. Maybe it doesn't heal right. But we're talking about production that we did not see 3 months later, 4 months later. We're talking about end of season. I get it that injuries happen, but this is also something that it didn't get better for him. It doesn't seem like there was ever a time where he was the explosive running back we used to see. And how often do we see these 29-year-old running backs bounce back from injury? It's the same thing that we talked about with Nick Chubb. Not the exact same, but it's an
Come on.
older guy. It's an older guy coming off an injury on a new team, added competition. There's so many factors here working against him. There's honestly, there's other running back threes in this range that I'd rather have. Javonte Williams, who was in this boat last year, Jonathan Brooks, who has been steamed up to be even higher than that, but in redraft, he will probably go around there. And even Austin Eckler's teammate, Brian Robinson. I will take him 10 times out of 10 over Austin Eckler.
Yeah. Again, I'm agreeing with you. I just really want to know what this like risky thing is that you did in your real life that you won't talk about on the podcast. We'll
I
have to talk about
No,
this after we
it's
record.
not something that I did. Once again, we can cut it if we need to. No, I don't want to.
No, no.
It's like,
Let's
it's
stick
not
with
worth
Austin
it.
Eckler.
It's me saying this is the same thing. There's no upside to me making the analogy on camera
Mhm.
or on mic, and the moment's passed. Like, it's gone. Let's
The
just
moments pass.
next
Back,
player. Let's
back to
do that.
Austin Eckler. Yeah, I agree. Austin Eckler, we've talked about it a lot. Brian Robinson, is getting a lot of smoke in the offseason about his potential involvement in the passing game. And I've ran through the numbers before. We've talked about it on this exact show where I've said that like Brian Robinson was a very underrated pass catcher last year. His ability to draw targets when he was running routes, the plays that he made after the catch, that is a very underrated skill set that Brian Robinson has. So I'm not ready to concede that Austin Eckler is just going to take 100% of the passing down work in Washington. And that would be the worst case scenario is like, one, this downtrend that we're seeing in efficiency from Austin Eckler maintains. Two, that he can, struggle with the injuries again. And three, that he doesn't even have a stranglehold on the pass catching work. Yeah, he could end up being another bad pick. So here we are. What we've talked about 6 players so far, and we've agreed on all 6 for those keeping score at
Is
home.
it? Yep. 6 players, 6 of 6. We're crushing it.
Hopefully you disagree with my next guy, Alfredo, because this is getting
I might.
boring. All this head nodding, my
I
neck's
might.
starting to hurt.
I might. Honestly, I might just make it up on it, like, because I already see our rankings, and we're so close in rankings on this player that I'm just gonna fabricate something.
Curtis Samuel, that's who we're going to talk
Yeah.
about next. Yeah.
There's only one player left, so it's not like you could ruin my show sheet at this point.
Curtis Samuel, his best season was 4 years ago. And a lot of people are holding on to that hope that he can do what he did 4 years ago because now he is reunited with Joe Brady again. Well, guess what? That season 4 years ago when Curtis Samuel was 24 years old, it was the best season that we're hoping he can replicate. He was a wide receiver 3 that year. Like, it's not like we were getting, like, it's not like this was a guy who was a 1,400-yard receiver and we're saying maybe he could recapture that magic. It's a guy that went for like just over 800 yards as a receiver and scored some touchdowns. And it was a year where Christian McCaffrey was hurt and he started getting some weird usage out of the backfield that kind of propped up his floor and ceiling a little bit, similar to Deebo Samuel. What we saw when all of their running backs got hurt, we saw Curtis Samuel do the same thing the year before. Now, it's possible that he could break out. And I think the one thing, I think probably better evidence for a potential breakout for Curtis Samuel, people keep leaning on the Joe Brady thing, but I'd say John Brown is probably the guy that we
Hmm.
can use as an example for why Curtis Samuel might be able to break out. He was a guy who had never really broken out, and then all of a sudden links up with Josh Allen at 28 years old and has a breakout season. So like it
Can we
has
cue
happened.
the Obi-Wan Kenobi meme of "That's a name I have not heard in a long, long time."
Yeah, exactly, and that's it, like, that's, like, the one kind of example I can think of in recent history where a guy had done much through his NFL career and then suddenly broke out at age 28, John Brown with Josh Allen, so it's possible, it could happen. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen. It's just hard for me to bet on it. A lot like I said with Jayden Reed, I'm scared off paying up for a wide receiver in a cloudy wide receiver room. And right now, that's what you have to do with Curtis Samuel. He's going just after Keon Coleman, but you're still drafting him to be wide receiver too. And for me, I'll take my chance on Khalil Shakir, who in my
That's
rankings, I
my
have him ahead
baby.
of Keon Coleman. I have him ahead of Curtis Samuel. I'm a big fan of Khalil Shakir. So I'll just take the risk on him a little bit later and call me really crazy for this. I'll wait till the very end of my draft if I want to get in on this Buffalo Bills offense, and I'll draft Chase Claypool or MVS, who are essentially free at the end of your draft. And I don't know, maybe they can fall into a role. Like there's so much ambiguity here. I'm not ready to say that Curtis Samuel is going to be the guy. I think that it's going to be a good football move. He is versatile. Joe Brady's going to have some creative usage for him. But I think like the best case scenario, like if everything works out, for Curtis Samuel, you're getting what, maybe wide receiver 3 production. I just don't think there's a huge ceiling there. So, like I said, best year came in a season 4 years ago where Christian McCaffrey got hurt and he saw a lot of usage out of the backfield, but James Cook is there, Ray Davis is there. They're not going to be using him quite that way in the backfield, and it's just hard to see him replicating what we saw 4 years ago.
All right, so I am gonna disagree a little bit. I'm happy
All
we
right,
get to do this.
good.
I'm gonna do
Good.
the no, it's very small. I'm gonna do the Ricky Bobby. With all due respect, now I get to say whatever I want. What do you mean you would draft Chase Claypool with your last pick over Curtis Samuel in the 10th round? What are we even doing here, Dave?
I mean, there's been a drumbeat out of Buffalo, but
Oh, shut
Chase
up.
Claypool looks good. I mean, trust me, I'm a Bears fan, all right? Like we talk about like not getting personal with these players. If there's one player that I do have a personal vendetta against in the NFL, it might be Chase Claypool. But
He's the same guy. He has like a curse. Every team he goes to gets worse. That
yeah,
actually has me super nervous for the Bills,
yeah.
man.
But I mean, like, is Chase Claypool all that different from Gabe Davis? Like a guy who's not
Yes.
all that
Yes, he is.
sure-handed and can run really fast in a straight line. Like, if they just plug Chase Claypool into that Gabe Davis role, we'll be looking at week to week volatility. But like maybe Chase Claypool could be something in this offense. It's not something that I'm like planting a strong flag on, but I'm just saying
Too
like
late. You said it. You said it into a microphone. It's
rather than
over.
paying up for Curtis Samuel, I'd rather pass on Curtis Samuel and get Chase Claypool for free at the end of my draft. Yeah, I said it.
I'm not drafting Chase Claypool. Get your mind out of the best ball gutter. All right. Last player. And it's another big name, honestly. Like we've been talking about some players that have been later in drafts, like Curtis Samuel, 10th round, and some of these guys have been getting later and later. David Njoku, tight end for the Cleveland Browns, and 8th round is not like super early, but I want to call this the tight end dead zone, so to speak. I think you and I both agree that we want one of the top 7 or 8 tight ends, right? This year, whether it's best ball or redraft, whatever it is. And when I say the top 8 tight ends, I'll list them for you: Travis Kelsey, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram. And I think it kind of that line is right there with Ingram as the last guy because he's really the last one that can be a real target hog. And the struggle with me is I don't like the ADP for Njoku. I don't like the history with Njoku when it comes to he and Watson playing together. And right now, David Njoku is being drafted as a tight end 9 in the 8th round. And I don't want to have to draft him that early. If I'm not getting one of these top 8 guys, I'd much rather wait until like around 11, 12, whenever he's going and get Pat Fryermuth. Give me one of those guys. Give me just a whole slew of upside tight ends that I can stream instead of getting the honestly, it's not even up and down. It's just kind of bad when you look at David Njoku with Deshaun Watson. Let me go over these numbers here with you, Dave. Uh, David Njoku with Deshaun Watson. or excuse me, let's start off actually with this 18.2 points per game with Joe Flacco. And that's what everyone is remembering. The absolute just killer games that he had with Joe Flacco, the way he finished as tight end. It was 2 or 3, actually tight end 1 in like those final weeks with Joe Flacco at that time. But when you look at David Njoku with Deshaun Watson, less than 9 career points per game. And this is over a pretty decent span. This is not like over a 2 or 3 game span. You're looking at 8.8 career points per game in fantasy. For reference, that would have put him around tight end 16 in points per game, somewhere along where Taysom Hill and Hunter Henry hang out. And if you're telling me like that's what I'm going to get if Deshaun Watson is healthy, and that should be the best case scenario, I don't want to have to hope that Deshaun Watson is out. I don't want to have to hope that the backup quarterback, Jameis Winston, comes in and makes David Njoku better. Also, Kevin Stefanski has talked about how the Browns offense is going to be a lot more similar to what Deshaun Watson ran in Houston. And Dave, whether it's been Cleveland or Houston or any time in his career, Deshaun Watson has really never targeted the tight end. This has just been who he is, and quarterbacks don't typically change their mannerisms when they're getting older and later in their career. Maybe they'll dump off a bit, change who they really target. Their tendencies don't change that much. Now you see the Cleveland Browns added Jerry Jeudy. This isn't a thing where I don't think that David Njoku's talented. I just think the situation and the cost makes me say I don't want to have you on my fantasy football team next year.
Yeah, we just talked about David Njoku again in this series that I'm doing, and I totally copped out. I said like I don't have a strong take on David Njoku. I'm happy to draft him at ADP. I think he's pretty accurately priced. I draft him when he's there at ADP. He's not a guy that I'm aggressively reaching for. He's not a guy that I'm only taking when he slides in ADP. And really, it's because I don't have a strong take. It's like I've got a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other. And one guy is telling me, David Njoku, like this is a former first round pick, athleticism off the charts. They finally got it together. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like, look at what he did at the end of last year. The breakout's there. It's going to happen next year. And then the other part of me is, well, it's not a devil. It's you saying everything that you just said in my other ear, saying don't draft
Close enough.
David Njoku. Like he sucked with Deshaun Watson. So I don't again like I'm not disagreeing with you and I'm not agreeing with you. I just it's really tough for me with David Njoku because I see the case for the upside where they say like, wow, this guy was our best pass catcher last year. Like, next to Amari Cooper. But Amari Cooper's getting up there in age. David Njoku is at like the age apex for tight end right now where we should expect his best season. So I don't know. I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here because I don't have a strong stance. I think David Njoku's kind of accurately priced right now. There is downside. There is upside. I'm willing to take the risk, but I totally understand what you're saying that it could be a completely sunk pick if Deshaun Watson reverts to his previous tendencies.
It's just one of those things, right? I'd rather go great or late at tight end. Like, give me one of those top guys that's going to be getting the volume. That's going to be in a good offense that can be a top 2 target. And it's not to say that David Njoku won't be those things, but the likelihood of him doing it is just so much lower. And that's why I kind of called it that tight end dead zone. It's like I like Jake Ferguson, doesn't mean I'm actively targeting him.
Right.
So I'd rather draw that line in the sand right there and go after the better tight ends, or just wait altogether and not light a pick on fire, so to speak.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think the tight end dead zone, that's something I've talked about a little bit this offseason, and I think that's it, where it's Jake Ferguson, David Njoku, Dallas Goedert, all guys that like are names that we know and they could end up panning out, but would it surprise anybody if like all those 3 guys that I just mentioned finish outside the top 20 tight ends? It shouldn't, because like that's in the range of outcomes as well. With the top 8 guys that you mentioned, there is some security there. Like as long as they're healthy, we know they have a high floor, and all 3 of those guys also have top 3 tight end in their range of outcome. But yeah, if I, like rather than paying up for that group that I mentioned, the Goddard, Ferguson, Njoku tier, I'll take them when they're there at ADP. But I do much prefer to get the guys with upside later. Jonnu Smith, somebody like that I can get in around 17 or 18 that does have a lot of upside.
Well, there you have it. That's 8 players that we are not drafting. And, I forgot to mention this earlier, and I'll drop it here now as we're finishing up the show. If you're listening to this, head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe, because what we're going to be doing is the videos are going to be dropping the day before. So you're going to get the videos right now. We're switching to 3 episodes a week here in July, and you're going to be getting the videos Monday, Wednesday, Friday, whereas the audio, you're going to get that the very next morning. So make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube. You are going to get these episodes the day before. You get to see our beautiful faces, my cool Star Wars poster, Dave's Lamar Jackson jersey, his bucket hat. He wears it from time to time. And it's just, honestly, it's super helpful for us. Dave, put it on. Make the people happy. They like it. Those of you listening, he's wearing it. He's wearing the hat. But we got another successful show in the books. The hate train has left the station. We're done with
Hey,
the
we don't
hate.
know
We're
if
going
it's
to
successful yet. We know that typically when we
okay.
skew
We
negative,
finished
these
it.
are
We
not our
finished it.
successful shows. But we
The
did a
show
show.
is the show is over. We have landed the plane, the hate plane. We're gonna go back to being nice and having fun and all that fun stuff. We'll be back again on Wednesday on YouTube. You'll be able to catch that the very next morning on audio. Be sure you're subscribed to the Football Guys daily news updates, where you're going to get everything that you need to win in fantasy football, and you get that sent straight to your email inbox every single day from Joe Bryant himself. Thank you guys for listening. For myself, for Dave Kluge, I want to thank you guys for watching, listening all the way through. We'll catch you next time. Adios.